Hi everyone, Randy Littleson, Chief Marketing Officer at Conga, and today I'm excited to be joined by Tom Cowen. Tom is the head of vertical strategy for healthcare and life sciences here at Conga. And today we're going to be talking about the most impactful ways COVID-19 will change healthcare and life sciences. COVID results in many changes to the HLS ecosystem. Some of these are going to be temporary and others are going to be long lasting. So Tom, let's start with this. First, we saw an incredible speed at which companies like Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J ran their clinical trials and received approval for the vaccines. Can you describe the effects of clinical trial acceleration?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question, Randy. We look to the use of emergency authorization, right, and the relaxing of rules potentially around this. And I start to wonder how that will affect other deadly diseases. One that I know of within pediatric cancer, DIPG, is 100% fatal ultimately in children. And some of these children I know from these communities actually are getting treated down in Mexico right now. So I wonder, what are going to be some of those changes, right? How will this affect some of those diseases, which are really, very critical and deadly diseases? Downstream, we're starting to hear now a focus from some of our pharmaceutical companies that we work with, some of the stakeholders, and I'd say it's more of a renewed focus, right? So they've always been focused on clinical trials and how fast they can get those done. But they're being asked to kind of dig down again and really look at squeezing every last ounce of that out of that process. Now, some of these parts of the process are very, clinical in nature, very science-based in nature, and there's only so much you can do there. But some of the areas that they're starting to focus on are very mechanical, very process-oriented. And one of those, for example, is clinical trial agreements. So they're looking at how they can go and speed that up through solutions that allow them to do that faster and ultimately drive down the time it takes to onboard a physician to participate in an individual investigation.
One of the effects we saw out of the vaccines that came to market was one of the first successful applications of mRNA technology. Tom, can you first explain what mRNA is, and then what do you think will be the downstream effects of that on the industry?
Absolutely. Thanks, Randy. So mRNA is messenger RNA, which essentially is a mirror of the DNA. So as you know, probably 20, 30 years ago, the human genome was mapped and the code behind all this became available. And this has allowed, and I'll talk about a couple of examples, really the acceleration of how to develop cancer drugs and, in this case, vaccines. So prior to this, mumps was actually the fastest vaccine ever developed at 4 years. The usual, if we look back over the past century, was 10 to 15 years to go and bring a vaccine out to the public. So once again, speed is a very important part of this story. China had COVID mapped within 12 days, they say. BioNTech, Ugur Sahin, their leader, their founder, him and his wife, had 7 candidate vaccines developed over the weekend, is what he told 60 Minutes when I was watching. One of their taglines is be unique, treat individualized. And we start to think of cell-based and gene-based therapies, right, which are individualized to patients in many cases. We think of CAR T-cell therapies, taking a patient's cells and actually going and mashing those up and providing solutions. And these things, very unique, very individualized, also very costly. So in a lot of cases, these are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, some of these over $1 million in terms of their treatment for diseases like sickle cell, cancers, we hope diabetes somewhere in the future. So potential to completely cure a patient or change their lives completely through these drugs. But you start to think about the impact. I read a great report by McKinsey about a year ago, and they talk about the commercials that need to happen behind all of this, right? So if we look at the insurance payer who's going and funding that hundreds of thousands of dollars for that one-time or several-time treatment for the patient, let's say that patient or their family member moves companies 6 months later and suddenly is under a new insurance plan who now is benefiting from the results of that, right? Also, that big upfront cost really causing a lot of people to think about this, right? Making sure they're getting the value there. So what we're hearing a lot from the companies we speak to is a lot of discussion around outcomes or value-based agreements coming into the forefront. It used to be every 2 or 3 months we'd hear this. We're now hearing this on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So big change there.
The explosion of telehealth has been one of the potentially great outcomes of the pandemic. Where do you see this going in the future?
Yeah, so I look at some of the charts today, Randy, and I see, I'm blown away by them. I have to do a double take on the numbers. Sometimes we're seeing 1,000% growth. Other numbers I've heard, 20% of doctors previously used telehealth. Now it's upwards of 80%. I find that 20% even hard to believe. I had a son who battled cancer 6, 7 years ago. And, we literally got one telehealth visit within his treatment. And we certainly would have liked a lot more. There were times when it was very difficult to get him to a hospital or get him in front of a doctor and things that we needed to discuss. So, certainly something very welcoming. McKinsey actually estimates that $250 billion of the current U.S. healthcare spend could ultimately be virtualized, right? So we look at this care, and you have to look at it from a specialty basis, right? So mental health, certainly, big area, big prime area for telehealth. Start to think of experts. Now, maybe if I can't find an expert, somebody I need for specifics, that I can't drive 20 minutes to, maybe I can get on a phone call with the expert who's across the country, right? So delivery of healthcare to far and remote segments. So, I start to think about what needs then to happen contractually, what needs to happen from a commercial standpoint to go and support this, right? So, starting to expand provider networks, right, that can go and participate in these types of things. Also starting to manage the risk part of it. So what needs to be done contractually to go and make sure that, telehealth is going to be provided a little differently, right? Commercials on it are going to be different. What they pays and the fees on that may be different, but also, how do they go and manage risk in that you're not physically seeing a patient? So, a lot of differences that, and we expect continued growth around telehealth continuing to drive within the healthcare system.
You relayed some of your experience at a recent healthcare general counsel forum about supply chain choke points. Can you relay some of what you heard?
Yeah, certainly. So it was fascinating. About 100 general counsel, mostly from providers, and we heard a lot of war stories from them. So, literally they were arranging contracts and then standing on a loading dock or in a supply room waiting for that supply to show up. So they got deeply embedded in the business more than they ever had been. The need to go and in very quick order establish contracts with secondary and tertiary suppliers for PPE and other critical healthcare items that needed to be there, right? We heard about ventilators that needed to be retooled and those types of things, right? So the ability to go and contract, establish commercials on a very quick order was important. Certainly a lot of these agreements that were put in place had an effect on profitability. And then one thing we heard about, was the need for contract repositories. Well, so we heard from some general counsels who had these contract repositories, and I heard from others, handful, I won't name them here, but who had paper-based contract repositories, and I'm sure there's many more out there. But they needed to go and find things like a force majeure clause, right? Which in the past might have been a little more of a minor clause, now became the most important thing in the world. So could they go and find those clauses for each individual supplier, understand them, and then how do they go and recraft that to lessen their exposure in the future and protect themselves?
And Tom, government involvement in the pandemic has been both a blessing and a curse. What do you think will be the lasting effects?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I'm glad you brought up blessings and curses there. So certainly, I think we saw the highest level of partnership ever, I'd imagine, between healthcare and life sciences companies and government to get a lot of these great things done. So we talked about a heavier involvement in the clinical trial process, the acceleration that went on there, certainly very, very favorable. We saw the Defense Production Act invoked several times along the way here, right? And we just heard about baby formula and Abbott and other companies, literally a week ago. So, looking at these types of things, still there and potential to have those, more commonly used. Price transparency, so something that's been ongoing from the Affordable Care Act discussions almost a decade ago, still continuing, right? But the affordability of drugs and vaccines and global affordability of that, certainly more of a discussion now. And then the ongoing involvement. So I start to think of this, in increased involvement of the government, what that means then for companies within the healthcare industry. I think it points certainly to greater need for reporting, the ability to generate the documents that the government needs at a local, state, and federal level. And then certainly contract and pricing, being able to have those things at a ready, have those things defensible, right? If ever called upon for an audit, for government looks at those things. So, really starting to unveil and get more transparent there, I think, are key trends that we're going to look at.
Tom, thank you for the insights. Thank you for joining us. We invite you to learn more at conga.com.